Uh, Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Glad to be with you today. And as I was just saying to you, I'm very glad to have spent the weekend in Cleveland and with the community. And obviously, we did some stuff that was virtual, so opportunities to be together regardless of geography. As we were just talking about, this week's parsha is Miketz, and we are going to learn an interesting piece of Gemara that on its surface doesn't appear that it's going to be in any relationship, but I think it'll be fascinating. It starts off with a quote from next week's parsha, so everybody can get excited. This week's parsha is all about Joseph rising to power and encountering his brothers, and the whole mishigas of where they come. There's a famine. They're seeking food and resources, which Egypt has been preparing for however many 7 years. And they find themselves in front of their brother, unbeknownst to them, and that. And so, what I want us to focus on, what we're going to come to, we'll meander a little bit through the Talmud, but we're going to eventually talk about famines and the context around famines. The other thing I was going to say is this week's the Gemara we're going to learn today is a section that discusses the various circumstances in which you might be traveling, right? So obviously I was traveling a lot this past week. We've got this big storm happening and all throughout the country today or this week. So there's a lot of, people are traveling all around the country or the world at this time of year, just in terms of the broader cultural things that are happening. Thanksgiving was a few weeks ago, whatever. And so I think talking about traveling seems very apropos. So I'm going to share my screen here. We're learning in Masechet Ta'anit. Can everybody see this okay? Thumbs up? Yeah? Awesome. Okay. I'm normally on my desktop, but today I'm on my laptop, so you'll forgive me for being a little out of sorts here. I'm sure I can actually see it. Give me 1 sec here. Okay. I think that is as good as I'm going to make it. Okay.
It's a little bigger on your laptop.
Oh yeah, so maybe I'll make it a little smaller and it'll be easier to see, for me at least. Can everybody see this okay? Yes? Awesome. All right. Let's start off. It quotes the beginning next week's parsha, Al Tirgezu V'darech, which means see that you do not fall out by the way, which is from next week's parsha. And let's unpack it. Can I get a volunteer to start us off and read the very first paragraph here? And I would just, before whoever volunteers, and I can't see you as well because your faces are much smaller on the screen. So if you can use the raised hand function or just like wave really, wave a lot, then I'll be able to see you better. All right, Nelson and then Bob, I see you. Thank you. What I was going to say was the Rabbi Steinsaltz Koran Talmud, the version that we're reading from, has this really wonderful thing where it separates the sugiot with this little red symbol. All right, so just as by way of a sort of reminder, we haven't talked about it in a while, that Talmud is right. We have Mishnah that is separated out into individual units of Mishnah, and it's easy to distinguish between one Mishnah and the next because they're separated. The Talmud doesn't work that way. It very much flows one thought to the next, and so a unit of Talmud is called a sugya, and they can be very long or very, very short. And so, it's really helpful when this edited version, to be able to present to us the beginning of a sugya. We can sort of know that our mind is starting from a fresh place. Okay, Nelson, why don't you start us off and read the first paragraph here? The Gemara presents. And you're muted. I'm sorry.
The Gemara presents another piece of advice related to the story of Joseph and his brothers. Joseph said to them, "See that you not fall out by the way." Rabbi Elazar said that Joseph said to his brothers, "Do not become occupied in a matter of halakha, lest you fall out on the way. If you discuss a halakha while traveling, you might get into an argument. And it's important for travelers to remain on good terms."
Amazing. Thank you, Nelson. So I love this beginning. So first of all, as a reminder, the bold is the text of the Talmud itself, and the not bold is Rabbi Steinsaltz's commentary. So I think this is totally unexpected for the rabbis. The rabbis, we would imagine the rabbis would say, you should always be studying, Torah and halacha, whatever. You should talk about it when you're out and about. We talk about it in the, in the Ve'ahavta, when you're out and on the way. Here, Rabbi Elazar gives us good advice, right? Do not become occupied in a matter of halacha lest you fall out on the way, right? Don't get into any arguments, because that is not a good way to travel, right? What do people think? Is this good advice? Do people agree?
Yes.
Yeah. Why, Bob? And then Nelson, I'll come to you.
You could end up when you're traveling, you may need assistance. And if you get on the wrong side of an argument with somebody and then need their help, it's going to be hard to get.
Got it. There's like a very practical reason in which we might be careful, which is say, like, I might need something from my traveling companion, and therefore if I piss them off, they're not likely to help me. All right. Very pragmatic. I like that. All right, Nelson. And then Ron.
Well, first of all, I can't imagine Joseph ever used the word halakha. That's the rabbis projecting back. And the other part, I don't think this is too different than what we're told about the Wild West, where it was important not to discuss politics or religion. And
right.
halakha mixed.
Right. For similar reasons as what you're saying for Bob, which is you might get into an argument with someone and might lead to some sort of altercation.
But I want to say, everybody knows my politics, but maybe you. Actually, I have a neighbor who's a Trumper, and it's hard to imagine, but he came over and helped me, in spite of the fact that our politics are so divergent. And so I had a wonderful experience with him.
Yeah, I mean, I think but certainly the Jewish tradition is strongly proponent of people finding ways to be good neighbors and friends despite disagreements that we might have about the way of the world. Hillel and Shammai, who could not have seen more differently, famously in the Talmud tells us that their families continued to marry one another, right? The schools of thought, and then I mean that what a message of that, what that says about disagreement. But here again, we're not suggesting that you should disagree in good faith, although that's certainly true. Here it's don't even talk about it, right? All right, Ron, and then we're gonna read on.
I may be totally off here as usual, but I don't like the translation "fall out."
Okay.
The Hebrew word is tirgedzu, and the Sefaria dictionary says to quake, be disquieted, be excited, be perturbed, and I take that to mean about them finding Joseph and what they had done in the past, as opposed to something that would happen along this journey.
Yeah, so I think what the Talmud is doing is saying we have this verse wherein Joseph is telling his brothers not to get into an argument, and Rabbi Elazar is helping, using that as an analogy to say that's great travel advice in general. Rabbi Elazar is imagining, right? He's as I think Nelson pointed out, it's probably unlikely that Joseph was talking about halacha, right? Based on our previous conversations, we know rabbis love to imagine them doing so. But Rabbi Elazar is really giving advice in Joseph's name, which is don't get into arguments on the road, right? And for him, that's going to be about halacha. But your point well made, which is that there is and Nelson, you have made it as well. There is really we're talking about sort of an anachronism where Rabbi Elazar is speaking in the name of Joseph. All right, Bob, I think you were the next person who said you were going to read. So the Gemara asks.
The Gemara asks, is that so? But didn't Rabbi Eli Bar Berekia say, with regard to two Torah scholars who are walking along the road and there are no Torah matters discussed between them, they are worthy of being burned, as it is stated. And it came to pass, as they still went on and talked, that behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, which parted them both asunder. The reason that the chariot of fire did not harm Elisha is because there was a Torah matter between them, from which it may be inferred that had they not been discussing a Torah matter, they would have been worthy of being burned.
Okay. So here we have this circumstance, right, where Rabbi Elazar is saying, don't talk about halacha. The Gemara is surprised at this, as I was, right? Don't we have a teaching that Torah scholars who are out and about and they don't talk about Torah, like that's wrong? And here it uses the example of being burned, right? That they deserve some sort of punishment. And here we have this verse from the Second Kings, and we have the circumstance in which, people were torn asunder by this chariot of fire. The presumption being that they had not talked about Torah. Ron, I think I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I don't think it's worth saying.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So here we have the sort of second half of the argument. One side says, don't talk about halacha because you might get into an argument. And Rabbi Eli Bar Berechia is saying on the other side, you shouldn't be out and about without talking some Torah because, God's going to punish you. It's so important that you have to talk Torah. And so here what the Gemara does is something that it does over and over and over again. And it's so important that we understand it. So we have a conflict, a seeming contradiction. And so the Gemara always does the following. It asks us, we know that there's now a problem. And so it says, and I want you to look at the Aramaic here for me, la kashya. So first of all, how do we know that it's Aramaic? Because it's got aleph at the end. Many words that would end in a hey in Hebrew and in an aleph in Aramaic, just by having
it's saying, why is there a question?
So la is going to be the Aramaic word for lo, which means no, and kashya comes from the same root as kashe, something that is hard. It's a kushia, it's a challenge, and so we've got this contradiction, right? Because it says ini, isn't it so? And we have this contradiction, and it says no, la kashya. This is not a contradiction. It's not difficult. Here's how we're going to resolve the contradiction. It says, this opinion of Rabbi Eli Bar Berechia is referring to studying by rote, by reviewing material. This is Rabbi Steinsaltz who's helping us understand the differences. By reviewing material one has already learned, which is permitted and even appropriate while traveling. Whereas that opinion of Rabbi Elazar is referring to examining halakha in depth, in which case it is likely that scholars will come into conflict. Meaning to say, what's the difference between these two circumstances? What's the difference?
New material versus old material.
New material versus old material. If you're just reviewing your learning, right? You learn something and you're reviewing it and you're talking about it, making sure the other person's on the same page, whatever you're reviewing, great, no problem. Rabbi Eli Bar Berechia says, Dafka, you should do that while you're traveling, as distinct from perhaps a chavrutza session in which you're going to disagree and argue and try and find synthesis or disagreement. That is probably not best for travel. Yeah, Bob.
What material would be new?
Yeah.
When they get to the end, they start over.
That's true. That is a way to look at it. But I think just like us, there are always new things to learn. There's new things to explore that you may not have studied before. No?
New depth into what you had already studied, new interpretation of what you'd already studied, but the material is the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the rabbis here are offering a worldview in which, first of all, not everybody remembers or knows everything. Second, they're likely learning it by memory, which means to say that learning something for the first time and reviewing it requires a very different set of skills, right? If you're reviewing something, you've memorized it and you're literally just repeating it by rote, right? Just so you remember it. The Mishnah was memorized, for example. It's one of the reasons why when you see people who study Talmud or other kinds of things, they're singing and chanting it, because it's a good memory tool. I think that for the rabbis here in this context, they're not assuming that people learn something from the new time. There are always teachers coming and offering chidushim, new things, and so learning something for the first time or learning something new isn't necessarily out of the question. And I can share, I have a really wonderful, very apocryphal story of the Vilna Gaon, which maybe we'll tell another time, but which is to say there is great value in learning something as if for the first time. And so it's good for us to have that in mind. Ron, and then I saw you, Bill.
All right. There are supposedly 70 faces of Torah. And I'm going to say that you only learn one face per rotation. So it takes 70 years of learning Torah to get through all 70 faces. So there's always something new. Or you study with 70 different teachers. And each teacher brings something new. I mean, I've told you this before. I listen to Pardes, I listen to JTS, I listen to a local Orthodox rabbi. I mean, all these are podcasts and some of them are emails, but every one of them says something different about the same parsha every week.
Right. Yeah, I mean, look, the rabbis love the number 70. They have a real sense of completion when it comes to it. They talk about 70 faces to the Torah in the sense that there are many ways to look at the Torah. They talk about 70 years of a lifespan. They talk about 70 languages in the world, which is going to be relevant for our study here this week or next week. They have a real sense around 70. So yes, but which is to say there's always something more to be learned. Bill, and then we're going to move on. Oop, sorry, you're muted. Bill, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Why would you argue about something, not argue about something old, but you would argue about something new? At the end of an argument, do you agree? Once you've argued, you may complete disagree and then go on.
Which is to say what?
You agree to disagree.
Sure. Well, I'll give you a great example. I think you're the nuance, right? Which is when you've already disagreed with someone, are you going to be disagreeing with them more on the same material? I have a colleague who I love dearly. I truly one of my dearest friends, and we do not see eye to eye on quite a number of things in the Jewish world, and we argue vehemently. Doesn't mean I don't love him. Doesn't mean that I don't. It doesn't mean he also doesn't drive me crazy sometimes. The same person, I'll give an example. We went on a road trip together, and it was a 10-day road trip. We had a couple other people with us, and on the way back, it was 2 days back, and we were driving from San Francisco back to Los Angeles. And after spending 9 days with this person, who I love dearly, I wanted to kill him. Like we had so many, we had argued about all this, that, the other thing. I was ready to be home, whatever. And so I think there is something to be said for, again, that was a travel story, all the more so. But I think there is something to be said about, like, we've had this argument, we're just going to leave it alone, and we're just going to, we're not going to get into it. And there's something where we sort of opened a new can of worms, a new set of arguments to be had about a subject. I do think you're right that there are some nuance there. There's a difference. Actually, when I was preparing this, I didn't actually think of the story of me traveling with that colleague of mine, but it's very timely for this piece of Talmud. All right, let's keep reading. And we get more travel advice. Can I get another volunteer? Somebody who hasn't read? Helena or Eric or Judy? Anybody? We haven't heard from you. One of you would like to read? No pressure. Doesn't have to be a yes. Yeah, all right, Helena, and then Eric, I'll get you the next one.
It is taught in the Braita that Joseph said to his brothers, "Do not take long strides and bring the sun into the city. You should enter the city to spend the night there before the sun has set." The Gemara elaborates, "Do not take long strides. As the master said, a long stride takes away 1/500th of a person's eyesight, and this loss is not worth the time saved."
Amazing. Okay, so here we get a baraita, and we can see this introduction here where it says b'matnita tana, right? So it has all of those letters, those roots that have to do with teachings of the Tanaim. And so it was taught in a baraita that Joseph said to his brothers, "Do not take long strides and bring the sun into the city," which is to say, this is understood in the Gemara, which is that you should stay the night. You should go and stay at the night before sun is set, right? You don't want to be the one where like at sunset where things are happening. You want to really be there before sun is set. And then it has this whole thing about long strides, about maybe overexerting yourself or something like that. Here, the stakes are high, which is that long strides can impact your ability to perceive. And it's not worth it. You should travel with patience. You should take your time, and you should travel during the daytime and not enter at a place that is particularly in the evening. Yeah, Bob.
Oh,
So
wait,
that,
Oh, sorry. Bob and then Helena.
so does that mean we're not supposed to go on the interstate?
It's a good question, right? One question that I think comes from this, right, which is, what form of travel are we talking about? Are we talking about walking, which I think this is what it's talking about, but what happens if we're riding on a wagon or in a car, in our case, or we're traveling through a different mode, right? How does that make a difference? It's a great question. Helena.
I think it makes sense what they are saying, and it goes with being cautious. You go into a different place and you want to be there before night so you can familiarize yourself with it. Also, when you walk fast, pizizut, psiya gasa means you are walking faster than usual. You might get hurt, you might stumble, all kind of things can happen. And that's why it says that means that you cannot see. It takes away from your sight. It's not literally taking away from your sight, but I think that you don't see the helpless that you have in front of you.
Yeah, it's exactly right. It is a reminder not to rush, because when you rush, you're not paying as close attention to potential dangers that might be around you. You use the example of stumbling or falling. It could be that the rabbis talk about in traveling being very concerned about Lee's steam, about bandits, right? You may miss a trap if you're rushing. Absolutely. And here we're using the metaphor of limited eyesight, right?
There's also the positives of slowing down. You don't get to see the beauty of the fall leaves so much or whatever.
Right, absolutely. Which is to say that not only is there, we have to be careful around the negatives, there are actual real positives that balance things out. I like that. Thank you. Ron.
I'm going the opposite way. I purposely walk fast for a multitude of reasons. One is it's more aerobic, it's healthier. Two is when you walk faster, I think people think that you know where you are and where you're going, and that you're familiar with the place, and they're not going to bother you. So I think there's a plus of walking fastly.
Nice. So great. I would be surprised if this was so clear cut. Yeah, Helena, let's hear your disagreements.
Being a physician, I disagree with you, Ron. Okay. So we have three people. There are 4 or 5 different solutions. No, actually, they found out that that's not true. The runners die younger than the people who go walk. Okay? The runners end up with all kinds of arrhythmias. They hyperventilate, the potassium goes down too low, and they become arrhythmic. They have all kinds of arrhythmias, and a lot of runners end up with also, you see it, young people, soccer players or football players, all of a sudden they fall down and they die. And it's not because they have problems. But so that's not entirely true that if you walk faster, you're healthier.
I love it. I want to bookmark this because I don't want to get too deep, because the Gemara goes in an interesting direction that I think is relevant to this conversation. So let's bookmark it and come back to it. But which is to say that there are health considerations when it comes to travel in terms of speed or other kinds of things. We're going to talk about it in a second in the text. But there are health considerations, which is not where the Gemara takes it now. So I'm really glad that, Ron, you brought it up. And Helena, to add some medical knowledge, I certainly don't have. We did not learn about potassium in rabbinical school, so good to have that wisdom here as well. All right, let's read a little bit further. Eric, I think you volunteered before, where it says the Gemara further explains right here.
Okay, the Gemara further explains, and bring the sun into the city. This is in accordance with a statement that Rabbi Huda said, that Rab said. As Rabbi Huda said that Rab said, a person should always leave the place where he has spent the night with "it is good," i.e. after sunrise, as the Torah uses the expression "it is good" with regard to the creation of light. This goodness is manifest in the sense of security one feels when it is light. And likewise, when one comes into an unfamiliar city, he should enter with "it is good" before sunset, as it is stated, as soon as the morning was light, the men were sent away.
Okay, and that comes from this week's parsha, at the very end of this week's parsha. So here, right, we have a different, we're breaking down this concept of the sun into the city. And Rav Yehuda says, quoting Rav, right, that you should always leave and enter a place, right, when it is light, because it is good, right? This language of God created the first, on the first day, created light, and it was good. It was the very first thing that God describes as good. And so therefore, we should also align ourselves with that goodness by traveling basically during the day and not at night. Again, remembering that there's no electricity, that traveling at night is dangerous. There are animals, other kinds of things. We're not necessarily, even in cosmopolitan areas of various cities that they lived in, when you're traveling between cities, there's not necessarily the infrastructure. You're not going to have the way state, I forget what the way stations we have today, where it's got a vending machine and all the whole things, whatever, the bathroom, their world looked a little different. I'm sure there were versions of that, but not here. And so here we have, it is good to travel during the day and not at night. Yeah, Ron.
I like the part about the first light of the morning, because I mean that's what Abraham did every time he went to do a mitzvah.
Yes.
And so you wait till the next day and then you rush to do it.
Yeah, right. Abraham is often described as having gotten up early in order, and then the thing that he's described having done is usually attributed to a mitzvah. Some of them more good, better than others. He also does that when he goes to kill Isaac. But in either case, right, getting up early, traveling early, it makes sense that there's real value to it here. It's described in the framework of creation. It is good. All right, let's keep going.
I actually do that when I'm driving out of town too. I get up actually before first light, because I'm familiar with this area and I don't care if it's dark, but that way I have the whole day ahead of me to get to where I'm going.
I like that. I always like the first shift when I was going on road trips with friends. I always like the first shift too, in the morning. Just I'm fresh, I'm ready to go, raring. By the end of the day, I'm tired. I don't want to necessarily drive. Okay, let's keep going. And this is part of the connection with the Parsha, right? We've now quoted from the story of Joseph twice. One's from next week, one's from this week. And here we're going to talk about famines, right? And remember, famines are relevant to our story because famines are almost always in the Tanakh precipitating factors, which is to say, right, some things are going and then there's a famine and it causes people to take actions, right? They move to a new area. They seek out resources. Famines are precipitating factors and are relevant to both the story and to our conversation here. It says the following. Similarly, Rav Yehuda said that Rabbi Chia said, one who is walking along the road should not eat more each day than that person would normally eat each day in a year of famine. Which is to say, if I'm traveling on the road, right, whatever I eat that day would be equivalent to what I would eat in a famine, which is to say, I'm very cautious about how much I'm eating. The Gemara asks, what is the reason for this? And here you can see in the Aramaic, my tama, which is always an important question to keep an eye on. What is the reason? Hacha, here in Babylonia, they interpreted that the reason is due to one's bowels. Of course, I know all of you were going to go there. The reason is due to one's bowels. Since the exertion of traveling can damage full bowels, it is preferable to eat less than the normal amount. Okay, So here we're going to get an important piece of cultural diversity here, which is we have a question: why should one not eat more? In Babylonia, they said it's because when you travel on a full stomach, right, it's going to mess with your stomach. In the West, right, because Babylonia is farther to the east than Israel, so in the West, which refers to Eretz Israel, they say that the reason is due to food. So it's not bowels, it's food. If one eats too much, their food may not last the entire journey, and therefore a person should ration their meals, right? So one is a question of physical health, and the other one is because of resources, right? We have to be careful. We don't know how long we're going to be traveling for, what issues we might encounter. We have to ration, we have to be careful. The Gemara asks, what is, and this is so important, and here's the language in Aramaic, my benaihu, what is the practical difference between these two things? And the Gemara answers, Ika benaihu. Sorry, I didn't mean to highlight the whole thing. Ika benaihu. Okay. Here's such an important piece of how Talmud functions. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes? Okay. We now have two reasons for why a person should be careful about how much they eat. So if the conclusion is the same, the rabbis need to understand why do they have different reasons? What's the difference between their reasoning? Is there a reason why? My benaihu, my is the same word as ma in Hebrew. It introduces a question, often a what kind of question, as opposed to a why question or a how question. Benaihu is like beinehem, between the two of them. And the word ika is Aramaic for the word yesh, which is there is. And so the paragraph has been cut in half. And so the question, before we read ahead and find out the answer, what do you think the difference is? What's the practical difference between the Babylonian interpretation and the Eretz Israeli interpretation of why one should limit the amount of food? What do we think the reason between, one being careful for one's bowelly health and another about food resources? Bob.
The only practical difference that I see is the availability of food. So the Western opinion, so that you would have enough food to last the journey, is if you knew there was a place you could stop along the way or places along the way where you could get enough food, then you wouldn't have to follow that. Whereas the other one, there's no way around it.
Right. So meaning to say in the Eretz Israeli opinion, the Western opinion, right, it's resolvable. If you know that there's food along the way, you don't have to worry about it. But as you said, in the Babylonian worldview, right, it doesn't matter how much food you have with you or how much you can have access to. You have a health reason why not to do it. Okay. Other opinions? Yeah, Nelson.
I actually want to go back to a point that you said a moment ago. You said you get tired at night, you don't like to drive, and that's a reason to get there before the sun sets.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree, right? You were clear more, each person being different, but I'm certainly more clear-minded in the morning. I'm less likely to make a decision that might be harmful. Yeah, great. I'm glad you added that. Thank you. Anyone else want to propose? Yeah, Ron.
Well, that actually leads to another reason why you should take big strides. You get there faster before your food runs out. But if you're walking, you actually exert more energy and you need more food.
As opposed to
not less.
As opposed to what?
Well, no, it says that you should.
No, you're saying when you're walking. You should eat like there's
it says you should eat like there's a famine. And I say, no, you need more. That's not enough.
Right, because you're comparing it to a different mode of transportation.
Right. I mean, if you're not walking, fine. You probably do need less because you're sitting around not exerting any energy.
Got it.
But if you're walking, you need more. But I do cut down how much I'm eating when I'm traveling because of the first reason, the bowel problem.
Look, I think we forget sometimes, because this was 1600 years ago. Rabbis were human beings with like real lived experiences, and even if all the reasons don't quite exactly line up with ours, there's some truth. They have some lived experience. They know from what they speak, at least on some level. All right, let's keep going. Let's find out what they believe the practical differences are. And yeah, I think it'll be interesting. So what's the practical difference between them? The practical difference is when one person is sitting in a boat, a traveler must be concerned about their food supply, but they need not worry about the jostling of the road might force them to exert themselves, which has a tendency to cause digestive problems. Alternatively, the practical difference is in a case where one is traveling from station, avna, to station, and therefore the exertion of the road might cause digestive problems, but one need not be concerned about running out of food as they can resupply along the way. This group has identified both practical reasons, right? One is if you're traveling by boat, you don't have to worry about exertion. Your digestion issues may or may not be relevant. And the alternative difference is that when you're traveling and you know that there's food, you don't have to worry about it, whether or not you're going to run out of resources. Those are both the things that we mentioned in our discussion. And I love it. It's always so satisfying. I hope you feel this way. That's like, you got to anticipate the Talmud. You knew where the rabbis were going, even though we hadn't read it yet. And I think that means we understood the text well, or at least we understood the rabbis well. Yeah, Nelson.
I don't know. I'm sitting in a boat. I'm always worried about getting seasick.
A whole different set of digestive problems.
Yes. I don't want to eat too much because then I'll just throw it out.
Yeah, we might revisit your food.
But the
nowadays you don't have to worry about
seasickness.
seasickness. You have to worry about air sickness.
Yeah, whatever mode of transportation. Yeah, Nelson, finish your thought.
Like a lot of people my age, I suffer a bit from type 2 diabetes, which means if I eat a big meal, I tend to get sleepy.
Mm.
So if I'm traveling, I don't want to eat a big meal. I want to eat lightly.
So again, we've been able to add a number of different layers to this recommendation by the rabbis, which is you should be careful how much you eat when you travel. We've added a number of our own. The rabbis have certainly added some, but clearly there's some truth to it as to why we should be careful. All right, let's read a little bit more. And we get a story, right? So the rabbis have like the halacha sort of discussion pieces, and here we have a story. Somebody want to read? The Gemara relates a story about Rav Papa. Does anybody want to read for us? Okay. The Gemara relates that when Rav Papa traveled along each and every parsang, and we talked about this before, a parsang or parasang or whatever, a parsa is like a mile, or it's like 3/4 of a mile or something like that, right? Along each and every parsang, Rav Papa would eat one loaf of bread. Rav Papa did so because he maintained the prohibition that was due to the bowels, and as he was healthy, he was not concerned about travel by road would irritate his digestion. So for him, he ate liberally. He ate as much as he needed to eat. Wasn't worried about getting sick. Rav Yehuda said that Rav said, right? Again, we have a quote from Rav Yehuda and Rav before. Anyone who has food for themselves, but nevertheless starves themselves in years of famine, will be saved from an unusual death. As it is stated, in famine, God will redeem you from death. This is derived from the precise wording of the verse. According to a straightforward meaning, instead of in famine, it should have said from famine, as one is delivered from famine. Rather, this is what the verse is saying. As a reward for starving oneself in years of famine, Job will be saved from an unusual death. Which is to say, right, that if you are extra careful in a famine, right, you will be protected, according to this teaching, right? Meaning to say, when you what is it? The colloquialism, right? Everyone who tightens their belts, they're going to be protected from this unusual death. And the reason why they say that is because in the verse itself, Bara'av padcha mimavet, right? It would say, the question would be, why does it say Bara'av in a famine as opposed to being saved from a famine? Here they're understanding the nuance of that one letter means that you're being saved from an unusual death as opposed to being dying from the famine the context of the famine itself. Again, regardless of the particular interpretation of the verse, we have this sort of principle, which is use your resources wisely, right? Especially in a year of famine, use it wisely. Any thoughts on this before we move on a little bit more? Okay, famines. That's the whole trick. And here we get another interesting famine teaching coming from this week's parsha. Amar Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish is he has another name, which of course now escapes me. But he's very famous. He's one of the pairs who disagreed with each other at the particular era. Similarly, Reish Lakish would say it is prohibited for a person to have conjugal relations in years of famine, so that children will not be born during these difficult years. As it is stated, and Joseph were born 2 sons before the year of famine came. Right. So here they're doing this sort of interesting thing. Well, it was before the famine, because if it was during the famine, it might be a problem, according to this. It was taught in a baraita. Nevertheless, those without children may have marital relations in years of famine, as they must strive to fulfill the mitzvah to be fruitful and multiply. So here, the rabbis believed every part of life was full of Torah, and having sex and building a family was not excluded from that. And here, Reish Lakish says, during a famine, you shouldn't have children unless you have no children, and then perhaps it's okay. What do people think about this? What do people think about this? Do people agree? I mean, this is very complicated. This is a very deep level, theological worldview, whether or not you think God said it or not, about what does it mean to be a human during times of distress and danger? What do people think?
The murder rate would go up.
The murder rate would go up? Say more.
People would be not in normal circumstances. Tempers would be short. I mean, all of people's functions would be disturbed.
Right, which is to say that during a time of famine, people, because resources are so thin for so many, people might act poorly towards one another as a result.
And
Yes?
and denying sexual relations would just make it more so.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood you. So you're suggesting Reish Lakish is making a mistake, which is to say that when people's lives are so difficult during a famine, to encourage them not to have sex might actually be unhelpful, to say the least. Did I understand you?
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't catch you at the beginning. I'm with you now. Okay, that's certainly an interesting take. I don't know that the Reish Lakish would have considered that, but I think a good one. And look, we know, for better and for worse, that there was a huge spike in children at the 9 months after COVID began. Perhaps there's a lesson in that somewhere. Ron.
Yeah, if Reish Lakish was correct, then we wouldn't have a Moshe, because his parents wouldn't have conceived him. It had nothing to do with famine, but other hard time.
Right. The Jewish people are experiencing,
Right.
the Israelites are experiencing.
And we also wouldn't have all those babies that were born during the Holocaust.
Right. Which is to say, life goes on, even amongst suffering. You can't let it control every part of your life. You have to keep living, and building a family or having sex is a part of that. Okay, I think these are fair challenges to Reish Lakish. Certainly.
Actually, the protection would be for you shouldn't have relations in the year before a famine.
Right, which is why the Joseph line is so challenging, because that's exactly what happened.
Because if you were to not have children in the year before the famine, you wouldn't know when the famine was. So you would deny having children at all.
That's like doing teshuvah the day before you die. But also, I mean, in this particular case, though, with Joseph, he knew the famine was coming, and he didn't.
Right.
It's not like he didn't know, and he knew when it was coming.
I think, yes. I mean, I think all of that there's truth to every bit of that. There's some real complexity here. I certainly don't propose a single answer, but I think that there's a real challenge, which is how do we collectively deal when suffering is either up ahead or we're encountering it? Yeah, Nelson, I see you.
Well, they live in a world without birth control, perhaps, but we don't. So that if we're worried about bringing children into the world, and maybe we shouldn't worry about it, I understand, but we do have birth control, and we can carry on sexual relations without having to worry about pregnancy.
Yeah, so I think that's a nice point. I have to imagine that in the ancient world there were forms of birth control of different types. Certainly not going to be equivalent to what we have today. They were pretty savvy, but I think the point remains, which is to say that when we're talking about pregnancy and the danger of pregnancy and the danger of having extra mouths to feed, there potentially there are real considerations need to be had during times of real challenge, as distinct perhaps from the pleasurable relational parts that come with a sexual relationship that aren't necessarily tied specifically to childbearing. The rabbis definitely in the Talmud famously talk about sex as not just a procreative act, but one that is part of the relationships between partners. And so there is definitely a nuance here, right? Reish Lakish is simplifying something that maybe is more that has more nuance than that. With that in mind, with this sort of what does it look like for us to navigate difficult times, distress? The rabbis go on and offer this, these two teachings that I think are really powerful. And for those of you who know, I was a rabbi in Pittsburgh, in and around the shooting that happened there. I think a lot about the suffering a community might experience, and we live in a time of certainly where it feels as though there's significant anti-Semitism in the United States. It would not be unreasonable for us to feel a sense of distress. And here, I think the rabbis offer something pretty powerful. Let's unpack it together with our last few minutes left. So it says this: it's a baraita. Likewise, the sages taught in a baraita, when the Jewish people is immersed in distress, and one separates themselves from the community and does not share in their suffering, the two ministering angels who accompany a person come and place their hands on that person's head as though they were an offering and say, this person, so-and-so, who has separated themselves from the community, let them not see the consolation of the community. So here the rabbis, again, whether or not we think this is actually true or just story, the rabbis are making a point, which is if you separate yourself from the community, right, you should not benefit from when the community is no longer in distress. You don't get the benefits. If you don't get the tough times, you don't get the benefits. And I think there's real, I don't think this is simple, and I'm not sure that I'm suggesting that the sages were right. But there's a real difficulty here. Yeah, Bob.
I think famine is a substitute for distress.
Agreed.
And when they're talking about being separate, basically, if you're not suffering the distress that the community is, then you need to help relieve the community and not be selfish, whether it's food or money or resources of whatever kind, water.
With that in mind, I want you to read this is the last paragraph we're going to learn together. Read it where it says a similar idea. I want you to read that for us.
A similar idea is taught in another baraita. When the community is immersed in suffering, a person may not say, I will go to my home and I will eat and drink, and peace be upon you, my soul. And if he does so, the verse says about him, and behold joy and gladness, slaying oxen and killing sheep, eating flesh and drinking wine. Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we shall die. And the prophecy continues with what is written afterward in the following verse, and the Lord of hosts revealed himself in my ears. Surely this iniquity shall not be expiated by you until you die.
Which is to say, right, to your point, that when your community is suffering and you don't do anything to ameliorate that suffering with whatever resources you have, the Torah or the Tanakh, the book of Isaiah, is being interpreted here to say, God's not going to look kindly on that type of behavior, right? You're worthy of death, effectively. You and your community are not separate, is what I think the rabbis are saying here, right? That regardless of the details of whatever suffering, and I think you're right to suggest that distress here is very specific to famine, although I think there are broader lessons here, which is to say, don't separate yourself from the community. Be a part of it. Be a supporter. Be helpful. Bring whatever you can to help solve the situation. Squirrel Hill famously is the place of Mr. Rogers, and we hold Mr. Rogers in great esteem. I mean, as many people do, but certainly in Squirrel Hill, the church he went to is in Squirrel Hill. Squirrel Hill was his neighborhood, and in a way to help protect and help communicate to children about what to do in difficult situations and scary moments, he would tell them, look for the helpers. Now, as adults, it doesn't necessarily, life is not so simple, but I think it's incumbent on us to then say, we must be those helpers. That's our role as adults in times of distress. And so I think here in this learning, we're being guided, I think, very much to say, you got to be a part of the solution, not part of the problem. And so when we take a look at this broader piece of the sugya, and it continues on, but I think we sort of got the gist of it in this particular case, we have these instructions about how we should travel. Traveling is not necessarily easy. It comes with stressors and difficulties and limited resources. And the lessons we can learn around how do we travel safely? How do we travel in community, right? With people we might disagree with. We start to it sort of builds up until we understand that the whole community travels together if we broaden the metaphor. And that we need to be there for each other. We need to be supportive of one another. We need to help each other through the metaphorical famine, if you will. And I think, that the rabbis can offer us, again, we had a whole conversation about digestion. So, maybe we won't take ourselves too seriously here. But I think the rabbis are offering us good general wisdom, right? Treat each other with kindness. Don't put yourself in a position to get into a fight, right? Be cautious about your resources. Understand where you are, and to do it together, right? Don't separate yourself from the community. These are good, powerful lessons that all of us can benefit from, regardless of famines. These are good life lessons about how we should walk through the world, metaphorically speaking. And I think again, as it's connected to the parsha, we're learning about Joseph giving good advice to his brothers as they are returning home in a famine to go collect his family, to go protect them in Egypt, right? Joseph, who has been separated his family, is pulling his family in with good advice, according to the way the rabbis are looking at. Before we end, we've got 2 minutes left. Anybody have anything you want to add to the end of our learning today, just by way of summary?
When I go back home to Cleveland, I am going on the interstate.
All right, bring enough food. Any other thoughts?
Yep, you're going to drive at 55 instead of 70, though, right?
Yeah, Nelson.
I actually have a different question. So as I've been watching the Zoom, every once in a while it disconnects, the screen goes black and it reconnects. Is that my internet, or is that your internet, or is that everybody's?
It's you.
That was you individually experiencing that. I don't think you should understand it as a metaphor.
Yeah, my screen never went
Well-
black during the whole hour.
Wonderful. So since our Talmud related conversation has come to a close, thank you for learning with me this week. We'll see you next week. Everything should be continuing as per normal. We'll learn something else. and as it's connected to our journey through the Torah, and travel safely. I know that the weather is particularly bad, and perhaps this piece of Talmud is a good reminder to be careful, to take your time, to bring resources, stay warm, certainly in places where it's going to be cold. It's important to be safe.
Yeah,
With
Nelson, you may need a new wireless modem that's more powerful.
With that, I wish all of you a Shabbat Shalom, a happy Hanukkah, and we'll see you guys later.
Thank
I
you.
have